All right, next, let's take a closer look at some of the subregions of South America. That includes the Caribbean North, the Andean West, the Southern Cone, and the large country of Brazil. Paraguay in here is sort of like it sort of straddles some of the different ones. We'll kind of ignore that for now. By the way, when you see these maps and there's something that's sort of dashed like that, what it means is that they weren't sure where to include it, so they kind of just fudged it. All right, let's start with the Caribbean North. And the country of Venezuela here is a major oil producer in the world. In fact, it has amongst the highest oil reserves in the world. However, it has suffered a lot of economic problems due to the way they've managed their economy. I'm going to include some YouTube videos that discuss this in more detail, so watch for those. Next door is Colombia, and Colombia has a lot of similarities to Central America, altitudinal zonation, a lot of highlands. It also has a history of conflict, that you had an insurgent state, meaning a group that's trying to take control of the country called the FARC, actually controlling much of the Colombian territory until recently when they've had a peace treaty. A lot of the trouble also, it boils down to the narcotics production, especially cocaine and other drugs, that Colombia and throughout the Andes highlands, these are sort of hot spots for the production of historically coca leaves, which were used by the indigenous people, but things that are being processed into cocaine. I'll also include YouTube videos explain more of that, so watch for those. Okay, after you get past Venezuela and Colombia, there's three very lightly populated states called the Guyanas. And these were colonies of different colonial powers. In fact, French Guyana, right here, is still technically a territory of France. Suriname was controlled by the Dutch, or the Netherlands, in other words. And Guyana used to be called British Guyana. So up until 1966, fairly recently, this was belonged to the British. Suriname belonged to the Dutch or the Netherlands until 1975. And French Guyana still belongs to the French. Now, why aren't they independent? Well, one reason is they are a lot like a Caribbean island in some ways. It's a very difficult background. You know, there's a tropical rainforest and mountains, and most of the people live just right along the very edges of these territories. So you can see these sort of areas in red. These are where the people live. And so the population is concentrated on the edge right here near the Caribbean. So in many ways, these are a lot like Caribbean islands that are attached to South America. Also note the populations. Fresno has just over 500,000 people live in the city of Fresno. So on average, these are more like the populations around the city of Fresno. Not very many people. From 800 down to 540 to French Guyana, where you have something that's about half the population of Fresno. In the Andes, we have what's called the Andean West. And one thing to note about the Andean West is this is where, again, where we have high levels of indigenous populations. So for example, if you kind of average Peru and Bolivia together, about half of the people in Peru and Bolivia are indigenous peoples. These are also where we have many antiplas. Hopefully you saw the clip about the Potosi mines, are places where there's rich mineral resources as well. Jumping down to the Southern Cone, let's start with the country of Argentina. And this region here that's generally within the circle, actually it's kind of in this dark color here. This is called Live, and where we have modern commercial agriculture, much like we have in California. And a lot of what's called subtropical grassland that supports a thriving beef industry. When we get further to Patagonia, this is in southern Argentina and Chile, and this is when you're getting into the much colder, rugged parts of South America. Here's a picture in the background. These are support as much agricultural activity. In fact, sheep herding is the primary economic activity down here in Patagonia. On the other side of the Andes is Chile. And one thing to note about Chile, Chile is an extremely elongated state, meaning that it runs very extremely high from north to south. And because it runs north to south, it encompasses different environments. This part of the north, south, it's much like the climate of Canada, because it is far south as Canada is north. And in the middle here, this area in green is actually a lot like California. It has a Mediterranean climate, also on the Pacific countries in Asia and the United States. Quick question here. What about Chile's location in the world gives it an advantage for agricultural exports? Well, we used to watch a film about this, but it's no longer available, so we'll just talk through it. So here we start with this. They grow grapes like we do in California, but there's something about when they can grow grapes that gives them an advantage. So this is Mediterranean climates, so we have one in California, good grape growing region, as is the Mediterranean. But one thing to be mindful of, we're below the equator, we're in the southern hemisphere, so there's going to be one thing different about their climate from ours. This is kind of showing where California is by latitude and where that would be around Chile. And so where you see this Mediterranean climate, where it is north, this is where far north and south Chile goes. It'd be like a country that runs from Baja, California, from the tip, all the way up pretty far into Canada. So it's extremely diverse environments. Like Baja, California in the south here would be like the Atacama in the north. The southern part here would be like California. If we flipped it around, that might make more sense. So this part over here in the southern part, a lot like Canada, bottom part here, like Baja, middle part, a lot like California. But southern hemisphere, so it goes in the opposite direction. And that's why we have these different three environments of Chile, the moderate Mediterranean in the middle. And so again, this Chile is a good grapes like the Mediterranean. So again, what about its location in the world gives it an advantage? It has to do with its seasonal patterns, temperature throughout the year, and also the rainfall throughout the year. And this is for, actually, this is for Red Bluff in California, which has a Mediterranean climate. You can see it's warmer in the summer, cooler in the winter. There's rain in the wintertime, it really drops off and picks up back in the winter. Now in Chile, it's the opposite because they're in the southern hemisphere. And because they have opposite seasons from us, where our grape growing season might be around there, their grape growing season might be over here. So around Christmas time, when we can't get grapes locally, we can import grapes from Chile. And that gives Chile a competitive advantage that they can grow grapes at the time of year when California cannot. Let's talk about Brazil for a moment. One thing about Brazil is it has high levels of rural to urban migration, and part of that has resulted in what's called informal settlements, or what they call favelas, informal settlements on the outskirts of cities. So in these large megacities, a lot of them extend really far into these sort of informal settlement areas. In Brazil, they're called favelas. In Spanish-speaking country, they're also called barrios. Brazil is also part of BRICS. Hopefully you'll catch that in the chapter. BRICS is an acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Initially, it was just BRIC and then S for plural, but then they turned the S into South Africa it was worth it, you know, it met the criteria that it could be included. And what these are countries that didn't experience the Industrial Revolution early, like the United States and Europe, but began to develop very quickly later on, like in the 1990s. So these are sort of the up-and-coming new economies of the world. As it's turned out, China has really been the dominant one, India shortly behind, and some of these have varied in how well they've done over time. However, they are a real group. They do have meetings and everything else, and so they account for a large part of the Earth's population and a big part of the Earth's economy. However, wealth is not distributed evenly in Brazil, that a lot of the wealth is concentrated in the south here, less so in the northeast. I think I want to highlight this little spot here, like what's happening there. You get this little pocket of wealth. And that is the capital of Brazil. It's called Brasilia. And where most of the people in Brazil live along the coast, they intentionally put a capital city farther into the interior. Here's a population map. You can see most of the Brazilians live right along the coast. Then you have this one little spot on the interior, and then pretty sparsely populated throughout the rest of this is where the Amazon basin is. So the capital here, again, Brasilia, it's a good example of what we call a forward capital. And a forward capital is something we'll run into in the course. This means a capital city that's placed geographically for symbolic reasons. Sometimes people place their capital cities up at the border next to another country as sort of a hostile gesture. With Brazil, it was different, that it was sort of seen as trying to unify this large, wide country by placing its capital in the interior of the country rather than on the coast. And so that's a symbolic move. They did it like in I think the 1970s is when they built the city from scratch as a symbolic gesture. Lastly, we talked about Chile being really long north and south, and we said it's an elongated state. That's a real deal. Later in the semester, we'll learn about what's called territorial configurations, that some countries are in what are called elongated, meaning they're long and thin. Some are compact, like meaning they're more square or ball-shaped. And so I just want to highlight two countries here. This is Chile, which is an elongated state, and the opposite of that would be Uruguay, which is a more compact country. By the way, Uruguay, pretty similar to southern Brazil and Argentina. It's considered a buffer state, or sort of a small country, sort of separates the two larger ones of Argentina and Brazil. Okay, and there's more in the book. I've just hit some highlights here, so more later.